All right. So we here at Shelf Life Books are very excited to be hosting the launch of Stuart Ross's The Book of Grief and Hamburgers. Stuart will be joined in conversation with Kenn Enns.
Hi.
We have copies of the book here in store. We are open for browsing. We also have a wonderful online store, and we do local delivery as well as shipping. So wherever you are, you can get a copy. Before we get started, I'd like to say that we at Shelf Life Books acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Treaty 7 people, the Blackfoot from Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani, the Dene Sarsi from Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda from Morley, the Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley First Nations. We also walk in the footsteps of the Métis people from Region 3, Métis Nation of Alberta. For this evening, I'm going to introduce Kenn here and then hand things off to them. And then once Kenn and Stuart have conversed and read and done their magic, we'll open the floor to a Q&A period. So if you think of a question during the whole event, you can pop it in the chat and we'll circle back to it. And yes, also when the Q&A starts, any questions, pop them in the chat. All right, so Kenn here, my friend, also social media coordinator here at Shelf Life Books. They run our literary podcast, Bookstorm, as well, and have been friends with Stuart for over 6 years. And I will hand things off to them now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Han.
Yes, of course.
Okay.
I'll see you all in a bit.
See you later. Hi, everyone. So I'll start off with Stuart's bio here. So Stuart Ross is a writer, editor, writing teacher, and small press activist who made a start in the 1980s selling chapbooks of his poetry and fiction on the streets of downtown Toronto. He is the winner of the Harbourfront Festival Prize, the Canadian Jewish Literary Award for Poetry, the 2010 Relit Prize for Short Fiction, among others. Stuart is the author of over 20 books of poetry, fiction, essays, and memoir, most recently The Book of Grief and Hamburgers, 70 Kippers, written with Michael Dennis, and Motel of Opposable Thumbs. His collection of short stories, I Am Claude Francois and You Are a Bathtub, will be out from Anvil Press in the fall. Stuart has taught workshops in schools across the country and was writer-in-residence at Queen's University and at the University of Ottawa, where he created and taught a fourth-year writing workshop on experimental fiction. His work has been translated into French, Norwegian, Slovene, Russian, Spanish, and Estonian. Stuart lives in Cobourg, Ontario, and is joining us from Montreal, which is really nice. So I thought
I'm cat sitting here on Saint Laurent, and it's really noisy from the window there. So I hope not too many trucks come roaring by during this. It's great to see you, Kenn.
It's great to see you too. Yeah, it's also Calgary Flames versus Oilers playoffs here in Calgary. So hopefully we don't have a bunch of people just start yelling in the streets here either. I thought I would start by mentioning that you and I actually became friends because 3 years before I started working at the bookstore, I came across Confessions of a Small Print Racketeer, I believe, here actually on one of the displays. And it was at a time in my life where I was in university and I felt that all the writing I was doing was just kind of going into the ether and it wasn't connecting with anybody. And I was feeling really lonely and just like felt that no one else felt that way. And in your book, you addressed a lot of those same topics of, feeling like you're writing for nobody. And at the end of it, you had like a little email at the end of the book being like, if anyone else has ever felt this way, reach out, let me know. So I wrote you up a little email that started our email correspondence, and we've been friends ever since. And luckily got to meet in Toronto pre-pandemic. And I'm really excited to be the co-host of the event tonight because I think your writing's the greatest. And truly, in a spot when I was like, I am lonely and creatively unfulfilled and no one else in the world has ever felt this way, I was lucky to come across your book. So I'm hoping that
Nice to hear that.
other people come across this book and kind of feel similarly, and it kind of meets them where they're at too. So with that, do you want to talk a bit about how the Book of Grief and Hamburgers kind of came about?
Sure, yeah. It came about, I don't think that I intended to write a book. And I've never written a book as catharsis or therapy, maybe the occasional poem or rant. But what happened was early on in the pandemic, in spring of 2020, I got a phone call from my dearest friend, an Ottawa poet named Michael Dennis. And he said, Stuart, we're going to talk very briefly. Jenny told me he had just gotten a diagnosis that he had pancreatic liver cancer, and he probably wouldn't last beyond the year. I was, of course, devastating. Obviously, a million times more devastating for Michael, but the thought of losing Michael was absolutely terrifying to me. And a few months later, on June the 2nd, 2020, I got a phone call at 12:30 at night that my brother had, who was aside from me, the other last remaining member of my family, had a heart attack and died. Had just had a heart attack and died. And it was just, it felt overwhelming to me. And dealing with the death of my brother, we had a pretty good relationship, sometimes a little strained. And Michael, who was somebody I spoke to on the phone 2-3 times a week, he was like an incredible brother to me as well, and just a dear, dear friend. And I was trying to find a way to process this, to explore what grief might mean. I'd had quite a few losses in the past decade, and I just thought it would be a way to put my energy and my creative energy into something that would oddly be a distraction, even though it would be talking about the exact thing that was haunting me and preoccupying me. And I don't think that I thought it was going to be a book at first. It was just something that I was writing and I didn't know what it would be. But I've never written a book in such an intense manner. It was over the course of about 3.5 months from September till the end of the year that I wrote this. And it was almost like keeping a diary, very, very free form kind of a diary. And about halfway through, I think I realized that this will probably be a book, but then I didn't know if anyone wants to read this book. I didn't know whether it was an explosion of self-pity or an exploration of grief or what the hell it was. But the other thing is I was very determined to finish the book before my friend Michael died, because I didn't want him to be in the past tense in the book, and I didn't want to talk about his death. And he died on the last day of 2020, and I finished the book, first draft of the book a few days before that. There's a very long answer to a very short question.
Yeah. Would you want to start off with a bit of a reading?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's an odd one to choose what to read from, but I made a bit of a different selection than I did at the tiny live in-person launch we had in Coburg, Ontario about a month ago. So I'll see how this works out. I'm going to read mostly from the first third of the book. And I'm going to begin, I'm going to begin with the epigraph. This was the other thing about this book, is I didn't know how to deal with this material. And I was rereading an amazing book by one of my favorite writers, a New York writer named Amy Fusselman, who, if you have not read Amy Fusselman, everybody, and Ken, I read Amy Fusselman's books. And this was a book called The Pharmacist's Mate. And it had this structure that was sort of like poetry, sort of like an essay, sort of like memoir. And there was a lot of space on the page. And as soon as I was reading that again, I went, this is it. This is the way I can write this book. So it begins with an epigraph by Amy Fusselman from The Pharmacist's Mate. I want to talk to my dad, but my dad is dead now. I know we can't have a regular conversation, so I'm trying to stay open to alternatives. Somebody give me a hamburger. And he balanced a hamburger on his head. She deals in rubber bands and hamburgers. For God's sake, look after our hamburgers. Who stole Grandpa's hamburger? 407 hamburgers were how many? After he shaved his chin, he shaved his hamburger. Not with a bang, but a hamburger. Hamburgers crept into my poetry in my late teens, about 10 years after I started writing. They appeared a few years after I discovered David McFadden's poetry and Stephen Crane's and E.E. Cummings and Victor Coleman's and Joe Rosenblatt's. I don't know if Hamburgers appeared in any of those guys' poems. Well, maybe in David McFadden's, but if so, probably not for the same reason they appeared in my poems. Sometimes the hamburgers in my poems were actual hamburgers. Sometimes they were Frank Sinatra. Sometimes the hamburgers that showed up in my poems were rubber bands. Once they were onion rings. Sometimes they were Frank Stella and Joe Hardy, or penguins. The lines on the previous page are not lines from my poems, but they could be. Most of them would likely be last lines. Does a hamburger make any line of poetry better? I mean, better than it was before it had a hamburger in it? Other poets put an angel in their poems to make them better. Sometimes the tongues of men and angels. Or the moon. The moon is very popular among poets. Some people put love in their poem to make the poem a good poem. When I worked with Dave McFadden on his volume of selected poems, Why Are You So Sad?, I thought we would reproduce the poems exactly as they had been originally published and in chronological order. But first, the order thing. Dave wanted them to appear in random order. He presented me with a random order for the poems in the book, but I think the order wasn't entirely random. Dave was wily that way. But the other thing, Dave wanted to edit his poems for this new volume. He was a better poet now than when he had originally written those poems in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, and he could make those poems better. In several of his poems from the 1960s, Dave replaced the word love with the word thing. And it was true, it made the poems better. So Dave was a poet who put the word love into his poems when he was in his 20s and took the word love out of his poems when he was in his 60s. Here's what I do. I put the word hamburger in my poems when things are getting a little too heavy, because the word hamburger makes you laugh. So this maneuver makes a heavy poem lighter. You can lift it more easily. My mother was an artist, but she mostly expressed through being a self-taught interior decorator. She also made some clay sculptures. Two of them are on a shelf behind me right now, above the rows of old R&B and Black gospel records I used to spin on my radio show. One of the clay sculptures is of a ballerina sitting cross-legged, or perhaps she is a woman in tights. The other sculpture my mother made and I kept is of our dog Moose. Moose was a toy poodle whose pedigree name was Parque Ralphie of Russell Hill Road. We called him Moose. The sculpture has Moose sitting with one of his paws raised slightly as if he is hoping to shake your hand, or as if you had just said, "Shake, Moose, that's a good boy, shake." The sculpture, like Moose, is mostly white, but with a black nose and black eyes and some brown flecks in his fur. It is covered in a glaze. When I was 6 or 7 years old, my mother took me to the Art Gallery of Ontario to see a gigantic hamburger made of painted fabric. It was taller than me. This sculpture is called Floorburger. It was created by Klaus Oldenburg in 1962, a burger nestled within a bun and a pickle perched on top. Some of the paint was already beginning to crack and flake, even in 1966, when I first saw the gigantic hamburger. A hamburger can be art. That is the first lesson about art I ever learned. Klaus Oldenburg was born 10 days before my mother. He is still alive. My mother died in 1995. David McFadden died in 2018. My friend Michael Dennis, who was like a brother to me, tells me he has only months to live. Usually a loquacious conversationalist, he doesn't find much to talk about with me these days, but we talk often. I am reading his poems. I'm finding old correspondence from him, actual letters he sent in the mail, some from as far back as the early 1980s. Look, here is a book of his he sent me. He has handwritten a poem on the padded envelope. It is dated June 16th, 2005. He probably didn't keep a copy of it for himself. The Vanier Grill, poem for Stuart Ross. You're thinking you'll flip a coin. Heads, it's to the strippers and seeing what's up there. Tails, and it's Beethoven, the Ninth, and all that comes with that. Later, at a diner, some of the ladies straggle in. They've exhausted themselves with either dancing or the cello. They order black coffee. We finish our burgers, head home, talking poetry. I don't want Michael to be gone. I want to talk poetry with him forever. Though I'm a vegetarian, I want to eat burgers with him. Burgers, burgers, everywhere burgers. I sat with Nelson Ball in his kitchen, which was also his living room. He had emphysema and was hooked up to an oxygen tank. Some people need supplemental oxygen because they are climbing Mount Everest. Nelson couldn't even climb to the second floor of his house, where his late wife Barbara's studio still stood, just as she left it, as if she were working on a new canvas. I don't think Nelson would have liked me using the adjective late. He once told me how much he disliked the euphemism passed away. This is when we were discussing my being his literary executor. I must have said, after you've passed away. I don't like that phrase. It's dead, after I'm dead. No, I don't like it either. I don't know why I said it. How about croaked? That's another euphemism. It's dead. I think croak is an even stronger word than dead. When I asked him if he would like there to be a volume of his collected poems after his death, he replied, I don't care, I'll be dead. When I asked him if he would like there to be a volume of his letters to other writers after his death, he replied, I'll be dead. When I asked him if he would like there to be a volume of his poems for Barbara after his death, he replied, I'll be dead. A couple of days before his medically assisted death, for which he was eager and even impatient, Susan asked him again on my behalf if he'd like there to be a book of his collected poems after he's gone. He smiled very slightly and nodded. In stuff, there is grief. It's possible someone said that. Is it grief if it is over stuff? Someone else might have said that. I sat in my father's walk-in closet and went through his clothes. I chose some shirts for myself, a few pairs of socks. I took his tefillin, which were almost for sure his father's tefillin, Max Rozovsky's, and maybe someone else's dead's tefillin before that. I took a set of his cufflinks and a ring that is not a wedding ring, but perhaps a ring from the Independent Order of Oddfellows or from his bowling league. I took my father's bowling ball bag. I don't think I took the bowling ball. He used to win turkeys with his bowling. As a family, we did not like turkey. We also did not celebrate Thanksgiving. I thought Thanksgiving was a Gentile holiday like Easter and Christmas and Simcoe Day. I still don't know for sure. Everything in my father's walk-in closet was something my father had touched. My father had been in this walk-in closet every day. When my father died, I looked out the window of his 22nd floor condominium facing north from Toronto's north boundary, and I realized that God was dead. I'm an atheist, but still it was shocking that God was dead. Who would I measure my actions against? Had I ever measured my actions against my father's actions? I cried on the phone when I told my father's friends that he had died. I sobbed and gasped to find my words. Chubby Allen said, "Get a hold of yourself, Stuart." Everything in Barry's small office smelled like smoke. Every sheet of paper, every photograph, every baseball trophy, they smelled like cigarettes. I sobbed and I cursed Barry. Is anger grief? Sometimes I feel like I've definitely had my share of grief. I can't really handle anymore because I haven't caught up with the bereavement already on my plate. It's like working on an assembly line and I haven't done the thing with the gizmo I'm holding that I'm supposed to do, and more gizmos are piling up. Tonight, I received a message from my friend Michael in Ottawa. He is struggling. It is hard to imagine a world without Michael Dennis. But I know there'll be a world after he's gone, just as there was still a world after my mother's death and my father's and Dave McFadden's and Richard Huddle's. It'll just be a different world, a world that's not as good. But the thought of saying goodbye to Michael is unbearable. Michael had a wooden plaque made for the door to the guest room in the house where he lives with Kirsty, whom he calls Kay in his poems. I have stayed in that guest room scores of times over the last couple of decades. It is packed with books and art, like the rest of their house. The plaque says, the Stuart Ross Reading Room. We had a stupid fight around the time that plaque was installed. How I regret that fight. Our growing back together took some months, some bumpy months. How I regret the lost time that stupid fight caused. My stubbornness caused, maybe his too. How I regret that I caused his mind and his body to feel anger. That's not something you want to cause in someone you love. My brother Barry and I also had a fight. It was about politics. We had very different political views. Mine veered to the left like our parents. Barry's veered somewhere I just didn't understand. Our fight meant we didn't speak for a full year. But I knew I had to renew contact with him. We were the last two brothers left. Owen was dead. Barry and I had to talk. Our parents would be horrified to know we weren't talking. So we talked again. We agreed not to discuss politics anymore. We had another year to not talk politics before he died. I hope Michael is comfortable now. I hope he is resting. It's possible he can't get up the stairs to sleep anymore. It's possible he now goes downstairs to sleep in the Stuart Ross Reading Room. Michael, I worry that I'm too tired from grieving to grieve for you too. But at the same time, I don't even know if I have grieved. I still can't figure out exactly what grieving is. Maybe because it's a thing that doesn't seem to ever end. If I grieved right, wouldn't it end? If it's a constant state, isn't it just living? Whenever I drive from Coburg to Ottawa on Highway 7, I pass a big burger shack on the north side of the road. When I get to Ottawa, Michael tells me they serve the best hamburgers he's ever tasted. Please let Michael have another hamburger. This book feels like one big hamburger. My intention was to make myself face things I don't think I've succeeded in facing. To frighten myself. To make myself cry. To make myself mourn. To hurl myself into the bubbling vat of grief. But I won't do it. It's not like I don't cry though. I cry pretty much every day, even if just for a moment. But isn't grieving more than crying? Isn't it a coming to terms? I've never come to terms. I want to force myself to come to terms. That's what I'm trying to do here. Won't you please join me? Yeah.
Sorry, we have a very busy store tonight, so just took me a second to unmute my microphone. Thank you for that, Stuart. That was really gorgeous.
Thanks, Ken.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how in your book you're kind of wrestling with this grief and this humor at the same time, and how the humor kind of impedes you a little bit along the way?
That's a really interesting way of putting it. Thanks. You know, I don't think of humor when I write. I don't go, I'm going to put in some funny stuff. It's either this defense mechanism, or it's just because I'm an existentialist and I think the world's absurd. So humor sort of permeates everything, absurd humor especially. So it's interesting. Some people have said, when people say, I enjoyed your book, and I think, wow, but how can you enjoy a book about death and about loss? And maybe it's the hamburgers, and maybe it's the humor, or maybe it's possible to enjoy something because it's speaking directly to you. But I would say that the whole writing of the book was this kind of struggle and this kind of search for, we say, oh, I'm grieving, I'm mourning. And what is that? What does it mean? Does it mean just thinking about the person? Does it mean crying? But there's supposed to be, you're always told it's this process that you go through and you come out healed in some way. And I don't know, I don't know if I believe that. And maybe that is why instinctively the humor sort of came in, because I think that's ridiculous and I think that's absurd. I don't know.
Yeah, you said that you felt like compelled to write this book. What did that feel like? Like, what parts did you say that you knew that you had to get out?
I felt compelled to write the book really just so I could cope with the situation, the death of the last other member of my family, and the impending death of my closest friend. And I think that there's just this accumulation, and each death reminds us, or at least reminds me of previous deaths. So many of my mentors had died. John Lavery in Gatineau, and Robin Wood, the film theorist in Toronto, Joe Rosenblatt, Larry Fagan, poet in New York, and so many members of my family. And so the compelled wasn't that I was compelled to share anything with anybody or to get anything particular down to show anyone. I was compelled to do it as a sort of coping mechanism for myself, really. And then there was this big decision, as I mentioned before, of, so this is this very personal thing. Will it be interesting to anybody else, or is there any value in having it out there?
Yeah,
and
well,
I showed it to a couple of people, my friend Elise Friedman, and in Toronto, and Dag Stromsvåg in Norway, and my partner Lori, and they all really encouraged me to see it as a book.
yeah, there's like a really gorgeous comment in the chat that I hope it's okay that I'm allowed to read, Samantha. It said, "Thank you for your story and grief. I cried my way through it. My mom died 3 years ago, and it's like yesterday. I appreciate the hamburgers." And that's
Wow.
truly, that's what I connected with most with the book, is that, you know, grief is kind of a process that never ends. And, you know, I think about people in my life that have passed and it never really goes away. But some days you're just standing at a bus stop and it kind of strikes you down. And the only real way that you can also combat that like impending grief is also you need to look for the positives and things that remind you of that person. And sometimes it is a hamburger.
Yeah, I like what you said there about just being struck. You know, you're standing at a bus stop or you're whatever, and suddenly bang, and there it is. And there's this feeling of, I want to embrace that person, and would you please leave me alone?
Yeah.
And just all of these contradictory emotions, I think loss really does bring up.
Yeah, and that's really, yeah, what I think this book does so well is it is all those contradictory emotions. It is the intense crying, and it is the big hamburger thing in an art gallery. It is kind of both of those conundrums. There's like a lengthy list of either books that you've cited or art that you've seen included in the book. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of like the more physical inspirations of the book? You have, I was going to say, quite the reading list inside.
Yeah. You know, I think I say somewhere in the book, if I was the kind of writer who did research, I would go through all of my books and find all the mentions of hamburgers and all the mentions of grief. And there was only one book on grief. I can't even remember I have to wear my glasses to read these days. It's ridiculous. I don't remember. It was some book written in the 70s about.
Was it the C.S. Lewis one?
No, the C.S. Lewis one was that really came to mind. My friend Mary, when my mom had died, gave me a copy of Grief Observed. And I thought it was a pretty powerful book. I thought it was a really interesting book. I write quite a lot about him, about that. And I was fascinated to learn, because I did do a little bit of research, that CS stood for Clive Staples. And as someone who publishes a lot of chapbooks and folds them in half and staples them, I love the idea that C.S. Lewis's middle name was part of what you used to put together a chapbook. But I didn't go out and start researching for this book. And I keep seeing books now and I think, oh, you know, if I'd read that book, I would have talked about it. But that's not what this was. This wasn't a book about grief in that way. It wasn't that kind of an essay. And I think that the right thing was just to bring in things that I remembered from in my life, just bits of grief and hamburger mentions here and there. I talk a little bit about the poet and video artist and performance artist and novelist R.M. Vaughan, who over that period of time disappeared. His body was eventually found. And he and I had launched a couple of books together through ECW Press. I think both of our first books of poetry maybe were launched at the same time. And Richard had this great idea that we would each read one of each other's poems at the beginning. So we'd read a poem aloud we never read before. That's the one bit of research I did, is I searched through R.M. Vaughan's books to see if there were any hamburgers in them, in his poems. I wanted so badly for there to be a hamburger, but there was cheesecake and there was all sorts of food, just no hamburgers. So that was the only research I did. And the book wasn't really about research. It was about things that I had chanced upon. I mean, when I say the references that you're talking about, the sort of reading list that the book eventually builds up, just things that I'd come across and that popped into my mind in the way that you talked about grief hitting you when you're standing at a bus stop. I was writing this and suddenly, bang, this thing popped into my head and it went into the book. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think I wish I had done this really thorough thing. I mentioned at one point, Ron Padgett, one of my favorite poets, must have written a poem about hamburgers. And he has an incredible poem about hamburgers that I've read so many times, but I didn't remember. It ends off with, there are hamburgers, or something like that at the end of one of his poems. But I feel sort of bad about that. But it was this book of catharsis and a therapy. So there was no research and no heavy thinking, just spewing.
Just spewing. Do you want to talk a little bit about what your writing process was like for the book? Was it just spewing, purely spewing?
It was spewing in that I didn't think about structure. I didn't think about what was going to come next. It was just what I felt I needed to write that day, or what I felt compelled, is the word used, to write that day, was what I wrote. And sometimes the sections are only a couple of sentences long. I think the longest one is maybe 3 or 4 pages. And then sort of some images came to mind as I was writing this. And I'm actually looking for one because I talked a little bit about David McFadden here. David McFadden decided that he was going to have his ashes put in a Dilbert cookie jar. And he and his wife, the amazing artist Merlin Homer, found a Dilbert cookie jar on eBay, and they ordered it, but the lid came broken. So Merlin put one of Dave's hats on it. And the good thing about a Zoom reading is I can show you the. So this is actually a picture of the front of the church where Dave's funeral took place. And there is the Dilbert cookie jar containing what is left of David McFadden. And I don't know this religious stuff, but there were these guys in robes walking up and down, swinging some smoking thing, a yo-yo like thing, but it smoked. And one of them was carrying, and they knelt down in front of the Dilbert cookie jar for a moment and got up. And I just thought, that was David McFadden's great final joke. So things like that fed into the writing, but I never knew from day to day where I was going to go. And I left the book almost in the exact order that I wrote it. It just jumps all over the place, where in the way I think someone's mind chaotically jumps all over the place when they're feeling extreme emotion and fear.
Yeah, in the thick of it, truly. Yeah, it does definitely reads as like a very cathartic book for you to put out. Did you have like a self-care process? How did you sort of manage these high intensity emotions while writing? Or did it all just kind of go right into the book?
Yeah, the writing was my self-care project, and a little bit of indica chocolate bar at night to help sleep. I'm terrible at disciplining myself as a writer. I am terrible at self-care. I'm terrible at sorting out my emotions, and this book is my life's one attempt to really try to sort out, deal with emotions that I couldn't handle.
Yeah. There's some questions coming in the chat that I'd love to read you if you would like.
Okay.
So from Shannon, we have Stuart. We're both editors too. I wondered what the editorial process was like for you as a writer for a book like this.
There was almost no editorial process. The book is really raw. I did go through it again and I smoothed out some lines, and it was mostly adding. I didn't actually even want to add too much after Michael had died. I think that I in fact spent, I think it says in here, 1 day going through it and tweaking it because I wanted it to be the book that I'd written before Michael had died. So there's dates on the back of the book, and that will tell me, oh yeah. So it was written between 3rd of September and the 26th of December 3rd of September to 26th of December 2020 plus 2nd of January 2021. So my editing process was the 2nd of January 2021. And then it went to ECW Press. I think it was my 7th book with ECW. And Michael Holmes, my editor, had a few little suggestions. And then it went to the copy editor. I know Shannon's an excellent copy editor too. And it was Emily Schultz, who's a really fine novelist and a really good copy editor as well. And she found a lot of little mistakes and just little, very minor things to smooth things out. I got confused between John McCain, the American politician, and John, the guy who went off into the astronaut. I can't even remember his name now. Anyways, I misnamed one of the people I was talking about in there. She found that, but really this book, I wanted it to be fairly raw. And so I didn't want to edit much. And, but I was really pleased with the few things that Michael pointed out and the things that Emily came up with. So that's not a very exciting answer for another editor. Sorry about that, Shannon.
I have another question from Karen. Lovely reading, Stuart. Have you read Sarah Manguso's? I hope that that's what it is. Elegy for a Friend. I wondered as I listened to your reading, if the fragmentary form of her book might have been an influence.
No, but now I didn't even know. I've read a couple of her books of poetry, Sarah Manguso, and I did not know she had such a book, and now I'm going to look for it. So thank you.
Reading list.
I actually don't want to read a whole bunch of, all these people are telling me, read this book on grief, read this book, and I don't want to read those things, but I love Sarah Manguso's writing. So thanks for the tip here.
This is the first one. I have a question from David as well. It says, Stuart, do you think this is the most serious book you've ever written?
I tend to find my books fairly serious generally, even if I give them stupid names like Motel of the Opposable Thumbs and The Book of Grief and Hamburgers. I just like stupid titles, but I think that both of my, the 2 novels that preceded this sort of, whatever this is, memoir, essay, poem thing, hybrid, Pockets and Snowball Dragonfly Jew are very, very serious, though I think there's probably humor in them as well. But I guess overall, because this is the most blatantly autobiographical thing I've ever written, and there's so much death in it. Yeah, it's probably the most serious book, and I can now go back to writing stupid books again.
Sorry, busy for some reason this evening, busy at the bookstore. So we have yeah, actually, I'll get back to the chat questions in a second. I am curious about that. If, you have these serious books with such funny or humorous titles, like where do you get the idea for the titles of each book? Because they are, like, the content is quite serious more often than not. But they do all, I would say 75% of them have at least a little bit of humor in the title.
That's amazing, Ken. You just made me think of something that I hadn't thought, that titles of my books are hamburgers, to deflect from maybe the seriousness or the, I hate things that are really self-consciously poetic and so forth. And so even saying I'm a poet feels so fraud-like to me. So perhaps I give my books somewhat stupid titles or crazy titles, or maybe sort of humorous titles. I mean, my second book is called Farmer Gloomy's New Hybrid, and I know that's a pretty crazy title, but I don't think of it as funny. But I think maybe all my titles are, in fact, hamburgers that are trying to deflect from the seriousness of the work inside, maybe.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. A question from Samantha. Was the book as cathartic, and did it help you with your grief as much as you hoped? And is your grief as powerful as it was when you began this book?
You know, not to give away the ending, but I don't think I learned anything about grief except that it is this thing that I can't figure out and I still can't define. It was cathartic, I think was the word you said Samantha used. It was cathartic in the moments that I was writing it. It helped me through those moments. After I finished it, I don't feel that I don't feel any greater understanding of grief or acceptance of grief or of loss. It was just a thing that helped me through those 4 months. But what's interesting to me is I might be wrong about that, and I might be fooling myself. And I am getting a lot of comments from people who are reading the book, a few strangers, but also many people that I know saying this book really helped me, or I really related to this book, or I was so glad to hear that there's someone else who doesn't know what the hell grief is, like what is expected of us in grieving, you know? And so I'm glad to know that just to some degree anyway, if you know, some people, it's helped them. And so that's pretty neat. I don't think I've ever written a book that's helped anybody before. And mostly my books just confuse people.
Not true. Also helped me.
So
You had a single helpful book before this one. So
yes, thank you. Yeah, you're the only person who ever said that about Confessions of a Small Press Racketeer. I really appreciated hearing that. That was a book that gave somebody comfort.
It did, yeah.
I don't think I ever knew that before.
Well, you do now, which is nice. I have a question from Gwendolyn as well, saying, did Michael know that you were writing this book while you were, yeah?
I told Michael I was writing it. I told him I was writing a book called The Book of Grief and Hamburgers, and I showed him a couple of weeks before he died, I think. I came up with the epigraph. It was something that Michael said to me on the phone, and I sent him, well, I'll tell you, it's a bit of it. It's not true. I sent him just a page that said, "For Michael Dennis, we are the lucky men," which he said to me in one of our last conversations. This man who was near the end of his life saying, "We are the lucky men." He was, I think, talking about having partners that would put up with us as writers and having homes filled with art and so forth. And in the final book, it's in memory of Michael Dennis. So we are the lucky men. So he saw a version of that, but he never asked to see any of it. And I was relieved because I didn't want to show him any of it.
Yeah. Is there a reason that you had that reservation, or just didn't want to admit that it was?
I didn't know what effect it would have on him, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I told him that it was a book out of love, and that a lot of it was about him and about my brother and other losses, but it was something helping me through that period. And I was relieved that he didn't want to see it, because I didn't know. I didn't know what would upset him, what would offend him, or any of those kinds of things. And I hoped that none of it would. But the important thing for me was to be writing that book,
Mm-hmm.
and showing it to him might have hindered the purpose of the book of helping me through his own last months.
I have another question from Cindy here. The titles of your books really draw me in and make me feel comfortable, as though you, my question disappeared. As though you're a friend or an ally. That's really sweet. They are disarming. They are like an open door. Come on in, check this out. No harm, you'll have fun, even when the topic is grief. That's really sweet. Oh, I love that note.
Wow. Maybe on some unconscious level, I was trying to bring people into a book. But I knew the book was going to be called The Book of Grief and Hamburgers once I realized it was a book. Like that title came to my mind, but maybe that was a way of luring people unsuspectingly into that book. But that's really nice to hear that my titles, my weirdo titles are comforting and inviting. I don't like pretension. And as I say, I don't like overblown poetic kinds of things. And I prefer the goofy.
The goofy, yeah. A question from Conyer. Hi, Stuart. Now that you've done this kind of project of self-care, as you put it, is it something that you would ever commit to doing again, even if just for yourself, even if for a different purpose or subject?
Hi, Conyer. Thanks for being here. Conyer is an amazing poet, by the way. And I think it's what I commit to do. I will not commit to doing anything at all in writing. I will not commit to anything in terms of writing. And if I'm moved to do something again like this, I will. I don't know if I would. I don't know if I'd want to go through that experience again, or if I'd feel like I'm repeating myself on some level, because this book is getting so many reviews on Goodreads, and so many people it seems to be selling copies, and people seem to really be connecting with it. And so there's this temptation that, well, maybe I should do more of this kind of writing. Maybe I should do more autobiographical writing. I am working on a long memoir that I've been working on for about a decade. I don't know if I'll ever finish that one. That might be the closest thing, but I want to resist the temptation of writing a kind of book that I think people want. Because I really want to write the books that I want to explore. I want to try the experiments that I want to do for myself, and hopefully other people will get into them. So I've been lucky that way with this book.
Absolutely. From Lisa, question. There's that old saying about writing from a wound versus from a scar, and a common belief that it's better to write about grief after some time has passed rather than writing about grief that's raw. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, how those two experiences are different. Writing about your parents who died a long time ago versus writing about Nelson, Michael, your brother, or other more recent losses.
Wow. I've never heard that before. That's really, really interesting. As I say, I wasn't writing it as what will make the best book about grief. For one reason, I didn't know, and still don't really know what grief is. And I think there are people who experience what they feel is grief, and maybe they come out the other end with some kind of resolution. So this is a very personal book. I'm not saying this is what grief is, and this is how people experience grief. It's just me. And now I've completely forgotten the question. You know, it's interesting. My mom died in 1995, and I still think, can I just have one more conversation with her? And the only thing that changes is each year it becomes less and less likely that I'll have another conversation with her, but I never give up that sort of thought in my head. Just one more conversation. And I think that the death of my mom is something that's still very raw for me. I'm bad at math, but 1995 she died. So whatever, 27 years later. Yeah. So I don't know if it would have made, I don't know. I don't think if I'd waited 6 months or a year, I don't think I would have written the book, because I wouldn't have felt the need to. I probably would have written some poems for Michael and maybe a poem for my brother. I did eventually write a novel about my mom. That took me 10 or 12 years to write anything about my mother. I wrote a novel based on my mother. She told me not long before she died that she wanted to, she was once planning to assassinate a neo-Nazi whose name I'm not going to mention, but it was a neo-Nazi who was undergoing trial in Toronto and this and that. And she had cancer, and she figured she was going to die, and she was going to take this fucking Nazi with her. And she was an interior decorator. And she told me she was asking people in the interior decorating, where can I get a gun? What's an easy gun to operate? And I thought, the drapery wholesaler is going to know a good gun.
There's gonna know where to get a gun.
So, but I did write this book, Snowball Dragonfly Jew, and it was a book to honor her. And it was a book in which I think about 6 times she kills the Nazi. So I was sort of fulfilling the killing of the Nazi in that book. So
yeah, shout out Shirley, an amazing woman.
And then it did take me, Shirley? Do you mean Shirley like certainly?
No, Shirley.
Oh, it's her name, right? Yeah, I was
Yeah,
gonna say,
Lillian.
that's her name. Her name was Shirley. Yeah, so that book, that's true. It took me 10 years to be able to write that. So there is something to, I don't remember the person's name, but that saying that I'd never heard of, maybe there is something to that.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to wrap up with the last question here in the chat from Elise. People who haven't grieved don't feel fully formed to me. Do you agree with that?
Don't feel fully formed. Well, since I don't, oh, wow. I'm going to have to talk to Elise on the phone about that in the next little while. Wow. I don't know. That's incredible. That's an incredible line. I think I should just.
That was a good hammer drop.
Yeah.
Damn, that's a question. It just came in the chat.
So yeah, I'm going to leave that. I'm going to leave those words for Elise. They're amazing words.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking time of your evening. Yeah, boom, Elise. I want us all to just give Stuart a hand. Yay! Thank you so much for the reading. I'm gonna let Han close out the evening, but yeah, thank you so much for your time and your heart and sharing those emotions with us tonight. I really appreciated it, and I'm sure from the chat coming in, like everyone that was here really appreciated it too. So.
Oh, I really appreciate the conversation so much, Ken. Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Han. And it's great to meet you. And I'm gonna get to your store soon.
Yes, please. We're open for browsing 7 days a week. Come on down.
I just also want to thank. Wow, there's a lot of people here. I just want to thank everyone who took the time and figured out the time zone differences and came here to hear about the book and support the book. So thanks.
All right.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah,
thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, everyone who made tonight possible. Reading and writing are often very solitary practices for myself, at least. So I think when the community gathers around books like this that are compelling, humorous, and entirely vulnerable, it's magic. It's the stuff of life. So thank you all so much for being a part of tonight. And please get your coffee. Yes. We have them here. They're all over Canada. Check out your independent bookstore. Pay them a visit. I'm sure they'd love to see you. Other than that, that's the evening for us. So I bid you all adieu. Thank you so much for being a part of tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone.